Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a story about starting over from nothing. What would you do if you lost everything overnight, just to protect the people you love? Stay with me to see how this choice changes everything. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. When his mother left the hospital, she didn't say goodbye. She didn't argue. She didn't even look back. She simply walked away, calm, composed, as if everything had already been decided in her mind. But what she took with her was more than just distance, it was control. The change didn't happen immediately. At first, everything felt the same. The hospital room, the soft rhythm of machines, the quiet moments between Tieu Lac and the baby. The CEO stayed by their side just as before, still present, still calm, still choosing them. But then, reality began to arrive, not loudly, not all at once, but in small, quiet ways, the kind that slowly reshape everything. It started with a phone call, short, direct, and cold. "Your accounts have been frozen." The voice on the other end was formal, detached. "I'm sorry, sir. We received instructions this morning." He didn't need to ask who gave them. He already knew. Understood. He ended the call, and for a moment, he just stood there, still, silent. Because this was it. Not a threat, not a warning, but action. Final, clean, irreversible. He didn't tell Tieu Lac right away. He didn't want to. Not because he was hiding it, but because he wanted to protect something, even if just for a little longer. The fragile piece they had finally found. Inside the room, Tieu Lac was sitting up, carefully holding the baby in her arms. The child was still small, still delicate, but stronger now, her breathing steadier, her movements more certain. Each tiny sound she made felt like a quiet victory. Tieu Lac smiled softly. "You're getting stronger," she whispered. The baby shifted slightly, as if responding. And for a moment, everything felt simple, real. Enough. The CEO stood at the doorway, watching them, and something inside him tightened. Because this moment, this quiet, imperfect happiness, was everything he had chosen. And now, he had to learn how to protect it. Without anything else, that evening he stepped outside. Just for a while. The hospital corridor felt longer than usual, quieter, colder. He took out his wallet, opened it, counted, once, then again. The number didn't change. Of course it didn't. A small, almost ironic smile touched his lips. So this is what it feels like. No resources, no backup, no safety net. Just him, and what he could do with his own hands. The next morning he left early, before Tieu Lac woke up, before the baby stirred. He didn't go far, just back to the small place he had arranged near the hospital. Temporary, simple, nothing like the life he used to know, but enough. For now, he stood in the small kitchen, if it could even be called that. A single stove, a few utensils, barely anything else. He looked around, then down at his hands. For a long moment, he didn't move. Because there are things money teaches you to forget. And one of them is how to begin from nothing. He picked up the knife, slowly, awkwardly, not because he didn't know how, but because it had been a long time, too long. Vegetables, rice, a few simple ingredients. Nothing complicated, nothing impressive. But today, it mattered. Every cut, every step, every small mistake. The first attempt wasn't perfect, not even close. The rice was slightly overcooked, the vegetables uneven, the seasoning not quite right. He looked at the finished meal, then let out a quiet breath. It'll do. Not because it was good, but because it was real. And right now, that was enough. When he walked back into the hospital room, carrying a small container carefully in his hands, Tieu Lac looked up, a little surprised. "You went out?" He nodded. "Just for a bit." She noticed the container immediately. "What's that?" He hesitated, just for a second, then, "I made something." Her eyes widened slightly. "You cooked?" A small pause, then she smiled. Not because she expected something amazing, but because she understood what it meant. "Let me see." He placed the container down, opened it. The smell was simple, warm, homemade, not perfect, but honest. Tieu Lac looked at it, then at him, and something in her expression softened. "A lot. You made this for me?" He nodded, a little unsure now. "It's probably not very good." She shook her head immediately. "It doesn't matter." Her voice was quiet, but full, because this wasn't just food. This was effort, choice, care. She picked up a spoon, tasted it, paused, then smiled. "It's good." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "You don't have to lie." She looked at him directly. "I'm not." A small pause. "Because I've never had anything like this before." That made him stop. "Like what?" She looked down at the food, then back at him. "Something you made, just for me." Silence, soft, warm, different from everything before. They ate together, slowly, quietly, not talking much. But this time, the silence wasn't heavy, it was either full. The baby made a small sound in her arms. Tieu Lac adjusted slightly, still eating, still smiling. "This is our first meal together," she said softly. He looked at her, then at the baby, and nodded. Yes. Their first, not in a grand house, not with perfect conditions, but real, earned, chosen. But even in that quiet happiness, reality didn't disappear. It just waited, patiently. Later that afternoon, he received another message. Short, clear. "Your access has been revoked." No explanation, no detail, but none was needed. Because piece by piece, everything was being taken away. He stood by the window, phone in hand, eyes distant. For a moment, the weight returned. Not doubt, not regret, but pressure. Because now, there was no turning back, no safety net, no easy solution, just responsibility and choice. Behind him, Tieu Lac watched quietly. She didn't ask, didn't interrupt, because she could see it, the shift, the weight, and she understood, more than he thought. "Are we going to be okay?" Her voice was soft, not afraid, just honest. He turned back, looked at her, then at the baby. And for a moment, he didn't answer immediately, because this time, the answer mattered. More than ever, he walked back toward her, slowly, then sat down beside her, close, not distant, not unsure, just present. "We'll figure it out." A pause. "Together." She looked at him, long, carefully, as if searching for doubt, for hesitation, for anything that might break. But there was none, only something new, something steadier. Because for the first time, he wasn't speaking as someone who had everything. He was speaking as someone who had chosen to start again. Tieu Lac leaned back slightly, the baby resting quietly between them, and for a moment, everything felt fragile, uncertain, but real. And maybe that was enough. For now. But somewhere far away, in a quiet office in the city, the CEO's mother sat alone, looking at a file, not closed, not forgotten, just waiting. Because while they were learning how to live without everything, she was deciding what would happen next. Back in the hospital room, the sun slowly faded, the light softened, and the small family sat together, sharing something simple, something imperfect, something real. But the question remained. When everything is taken away, can love alone be enough to build a life. The next morning didn't arrive with answers. It arrived with quiet. The kind of quiet that sits in the room before anything begins, when the world hasn't decided yet whether it will be kind or cruel. The CEO woke up before the sun, not because he had to, but because he couldn't sleep. His body was tired, but his mind refused to rest. Every time he closed his eyes, numbers appeared. Plans, possibilities, dead ends, new paths, everything at once. For the first time in years, he had nothing, no company, no team, no safety, only a responsibility that couldn't wait. He sat up slowly, careful not to wake Tieu Lac or the baby. They were both still asleep, the baby curled close against her, breathing softly. For a moment he didn't move. He just watched them. Because this was why he had chosen all of this. Not the past, not the life he had left behind, but this. He stood up quietly, took his jacket, and stepped outside. The air outside was cool, fresh, unfamiliar. It didn't carry the noise of the city, no traffic, no constant motion. Just space and possibility. But possibility, without direction, is just uncertainty. He walked down the street slowly, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning everything around him. Small shops, street vendors, people opening their stalls. Ordinary life, simple, but alive. He stopped in front of a small roadside stand where a man was setting up a cart of fresh vegetables. The man looked up briefly. Looking for something? The CEO hesitated, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he had never had to say it before. Do you need help? The words felt unfamiliar, heavy, but real. The man studied him for a second. You've done this before. A pause, then, no. The answer came clean, honest. The man nodded slowly. Then you'll learn. A simple response, but it carried something important. Not judgment, not rejection, just reality. The CEO gave a small nod. That's fine. And just like that, it began. The first hour wasn't easy. Nothing was. Lifting crates, sorting vegetables, moving quickly without knowing exactly how. His hands weren't used to this. His body wasn't used to this. But he didn't stop, because for the first time, there was no one else to rely on, no one else to fix things, only him, and what he was willing to do. The man watched him quietly for a while, then finally said, "You're not here because you have to be." It wasn't a question. The CEO wiped his hands. "I am." The man shook his head slightly. "No." A pause. "You chose to be." Silence, because that was the truth, and hearing it out loud made it heavier, but also clearer. By mid-morning, his shirt was damp with sweat, his hands rougher, his movements more certain, still not skilled, but no longer hesitant. The man handed him a small bottle of water. "You learn fast." The CEO took it. "Not fast enough." The man smiled faintly. "Fast enough for today." A pause. "Come back tomorrow." The CEO nodded, and for the first time that day, he felt something shift. Not success, not stability, but direction. When he returned to the hospital, the sun was already high. He paused outside the room for a second before stepping in. Not because he was tired, but because something inside him needed a moment. To reset, to leave the outside world. Outside. Then he opened the door. Tieu Lac was awake, sitting up carefully, the baby resting in her arms. The small room felt warmer now, brighter, more alive. She looked up when he entered, and immediately she noticed. "You went out early." He nodded. "Yeah." A small pause. She studied him for a moment, his clothes, his hands. The way he moved, different, subtly, but clearly. "You didn't just go out." He hesitated, then smiled slightly. "No." A breath. "I started working." Her eyes widened slightly. "Working?" He nodded again. "Just something small." A pause. "For now." Silence filled the space between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was understanding. Tieu Lac looked down at the baby, then back at him. "You don't have to do everything alone." Her voice was soft, not pitying, not worried, just present. He walked closer, sat beside her. "I'm not alone." A pause. "I have you." And for the first time, those words didn't feel like comfort. They felt like truth. The baby stirred slightly. A small sound escaped her lips, and both of them turned instantly, still new, still learning, still adjusting, but already connected. Tieu Lac smiled faintly. "She's stronger today." He nodded. "I can see that." A pause. Then he added quietly, "We all are." But outside, the world didn't stop. It never did. In the city, the CEO's mother sat in the same chair as before, still composed, still quiet, but not still. Her fingers moved slowly across the surface of the file in front of her, not opening it, not closing it, just waiting. Because she knew something they didn't. Time changes people, pressure reveals truth, and eventually, everyone reaches a limit. She picked up her phone, dialed. The call connected. "Keep watching him." Her voice was calm, measured. "I want to know how long he lasts." A pause. "And if he fails?" Her eyes hardened slightly. "We step in." She ended the call, without hesitation, without doubt, because in her world, everything had a timeline, everything had a breaking point, and she was simply waiting for his. Back in the hospital, the small family sat together. No luxury, no certainty, no guarantees. But something else, something stronger, was quietly growing. Trust, not the kind built from words, but the kind built from choice, repeated, daily, without promise of reward. The CEO leaned back slightly, his body tired, but his mind clearer, because for the first time, he wasn't chasing something. He was building something, from nothing, with everything he had left. Tieu Lac looked at him, then at the baby, then back at him. And for a moment, she didn't speak, because she understood something now. This path would not be easy, would not be smooth, would not be safe. But it was theirs, and that made all the difference. The baby made another small sound, and this time, they both smiled, not because everything was okay, but because they were still here, still trying, still choosing each other. But somewhere beyond that fragile piece, a quiet shadow remained, watching, waiting, and the question still lingered, how long can love hold? When the world keeps pushing back. After his mother cuts off all financial support, the CEO is forced to start over from nothing while staying by Tieu Lac and their newborn baby. As the baby's health gradually improves, he quietly takes on simple work to earn money, learning to adapt to a life he has never known before. With the little he has, he even cooks a humble meal for Tieu Lac, their first simple but meaningful moment as a real family. Despite the struggles, their bond grows stronger through shared hardship and genuine care. However, far away in the city, his mother continues to watch and wait, believing he will eventually fail. As pressure builds and resources run thin, the question remains whether love and determination will be enough for them to survive what comes next.